crap, I have a history project to do, and I didn't ask Davinci or Karan for help. What's taking him so long? Hi, Jason. Sorry I'm late. Jaen Cuttree. I only chose you because you were my only choice! Why is everyone busy? Let's just get this over with. I don't want to be here any more than you want me here. Well, fine then. Let's speed through this history lesson. But first, you might need to change your voice. They won't be able to tell the difference between you and me. We're the same person, technically. Does this sound good to you? Yeah, that works. Now let's get started with the project, shall we? Chapter 1. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev.
How did you pronounce that name?
I write books, remember? Anyway, Gorbachev was an active member of the Soviet Union, and was actually the president of the Soviet Union from 1990 to 1991.
Sounds like he would be dead by now, right?
Well, no, he's actually still alive. He is 91 years old now. Gorbachev was a key part of ending the Cold War and the Soviet Union. He joined the Soviet Union in 1952 and would grow to become the General Secretary on March 10th of 1985. Jaen, why don't you tell us what his goal was? Jaen? Jaen? Jaen, where did you go?
Oh, hi Jayson. This ice cream's really good.
Gorb would quickly start strengthening his personal power in the Soviet Union, and his primary goal in the Soviet Union specifically was to revive the dying economy, which grew very little during Leonid Brezhnev's tenure in power. To accomplish this, he rapidly encouraged rapid technological modernization and an increase in worker productivity.
Did you just call him Gorb?
I can't pronounce his name, I don't know why, I just can't.
Fair enough. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev's strategies and changes failed to yield substantial results. So from 1987 to 1988, he initiated deeper reforms of not just the economic system, but the political system as well. He would put into place a few new policies.
Chapter 2. The Chernobyl Cover Up.
So before we talk about Gorbachev's policies, an important thing to go over is the Chernobyl Cover Up. You may have heard of it as the worst nuclear disaster we have ever had.
It all went down on April 26th, 1986. A nuclear plant in Ukraine exploded. That's right, Ukraine. At the time, it was still a Soviet state. The message of the explosion we passed to Gorb at 5 a.m.
That message, however, was very misleading. The message mentioned that there was a fire and an explosion, and that the reactor was still intact, which meant that Gorbachev saw no need to warn any of the Soviet leadership, and instead approved of a state commission to look into the explosion's causes and consequences.
The spearhead of the operation was a man by the name of Boris Jason Help. Boris Sherbina was the head of the commission.
Issue is, he was in Siberia and wouldn't arrive in Pripyat until 8 p.m., which was 18 hours since the explosion.
Why are these names so weird?
As if you're one to talk. You got people like Moray Marians who are gonna get in Mulstak Staklum Stulmak.
Okay, we can agree on that. Now, even in those 18 hours, nobody in the local Soviet hierarchy took responsibility for the dead reactor,
and as such, very little had been done to deal with the damage.
But this isn't a project about the explosion.
Alright, so let's speed up to the cover-up.
Okay, so the cover-up.
2 days after the explosion, radiation alarms went off in Sweden, and slowly the information began to just trickle out. The Soviets, very dumbly might I add, denied everything and said the disaster had killed only 2 people. Well, they changed it to 31 later, of course. Later on, in 1989, Soviet newspapers showed that 40% of Belarus had been contaminated, and 14% of Ukraine had been contaminated. Keep in mind, Belarus was 10 kilometers north of Ukraine.
So if Belarus was the most highly contaminated area,
and that means that those people
All of them had to live with the idea that they were contaminated. They were afraid to do even simple things like eat.
But yeah, that news led to even more chaos, and people began protesting against Moscow's bureaucracy. And this would definitely speed up the fall of the Soviet Union.
As if its fall wasn't fast enough already.
Chapter 3. Reformation. So, Mikhail Gorbachev had two policies. His first was known as glasnost, which translates into openness. This meant that freedoms of expression and information were, well, opened up, which meant that news sources could be open and honest in reports and criticism, and eventually even Stalin's ideals and policies would be completely rejected.
His other policy was called perestroika, which translates to restructuring. Whoa, it really felt good to say that word. Perestroika.
I taught him how to pronounce the word. It was an important word.
This would restructure the Soviet political system to be more democratic. Multi-candidate contests and the secret ballot would be introduced in some elections, specifically to party and government positions. Some free market mechanisms also started to be introduced into the economy. However, these economic reforms would receive some resistance from party and government officials who did not want to give up their control over the economy.
Glasnost opened up criticism towards the entire Soviet Union as a whole, and soon they would lose control of the public and the media as well.
One of the reasons perestroika had resistance was because communist officials were allowed to push back against these types of policies, as they did not benefit from them personally.
Gorbachev had always wanted warmer relations and trade with the developed West and East nations. In fact, he signed an agreement in 1987 with Ronald Reagan, our president at the time. The agreement was to destroy all existing stocks of intermediate-range nuclear-tipped missiles.
And in 1988 to 1989, he would oversee the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, who they had occupied for 9 whole years.
Gorbachev in October of 1988 would soon be elected chairmanship of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, also known as the National Legislature.
He would try to restructure the legislative and executive branches of government to release them from the grip of the Communist Party. In December of 1988, Gorb created a two-branch parliament called the USSR Congress of People's Deputies. Some of the members were directly elected by the people in the previously mentioned multi-candidate elections.
In 1989, the Congress would elect a new USSR Supreme Soviet from its ranks, and in contrast to the predecessor of that name, it was a real standing parliament with substantial legislative powers.
Gorb's importance would increase in late 89 to 90. He would seize every opportunity to voice his support for reformist communists in Soviet-occupied countries in Eastern Europe. He also agreed to pull Soviet troops from countries like East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In those countries, non-communist governments would come into power.
In summer of 1990, Gorbachev also agreed to the reunification of East with West Germany, and even accepted the idea that in the possible future, Germany could join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union's longtime enemy. Gorbachev would also receive the Nobel Prize for his achievements in international relations.
Chapter 4, the final chapter, Presidency and The Fall.
Alright, Jaen, we're gonna speed it up here. We're already way past the 8-minute mark.
The freedoms that were coming with Gorb's democratization, and in turn the decentralization of the political system, led to a lot of civil unrest in several essential republics, such as Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan, and some republics like Lithuania attempted to achieve independence.
In March of 1990, the Congress elected him to a created post known as President of the USSR, which had extensive executive powers. At the same time, however, he and Congress put an end to the Communist Party's guaranteed monopoly of political power.
He moved his country along the path to democracy successfully. However, he resisted any major shift to private ownership and free market mechanisms. He sought a compromise between the two, and that all ended in vain as the economy continued to crumble.
He did remain as the master of the dying Communist Party, but his authority and effectiveness began declining as his decrees and administrative shuffling were barely doing anything.
Not only that, but the public was getting frustrated and a lot of pressure was put on Gorb as he started to waver in his direction.
In 1991, some communist hardliners started a coup and briefly placed Gorbachev and his family under house arrest. Boris Yeltsin and many other reformers would soon free him, and Gorbachev would resume duties as Soviet president. However, his position had been weakened.
Gorbachev was left with an unavoidable alliance with Yeltsin, and so he quit the Communist Party, disbanded the Central Committee,
and supported measures that would strip the party's control over the KGB and armed forces. He also worked quickly to shift political powers to the Soviet Union's major republics, but things moved too fast, and Boris Yeltsin assumed the functions of the collapsing government as the republics all agreed to form a new commonwealth under his leadership. On December 25, 1991, Gorb resigned from his post as president, and the Soviet Union fell that exact same day, with the Cold War ending a day after. The Soviet Union had finally fallen.
And here's the resources I used for all this research.
Goodbye, class. Have a good summer.